I thought today I'd talk a little bit about some of my research. For those of you who don't know me, my research is at the intersection of public factions at a very macro level, but also in public fractures on a very micro level in terms of how do communities and small groups fracture? How does this happen? Ultimately, I do this with the hope of finding ways to understand ideological differences and the factors that contribute to these fractures, with the hope, maybe a little idealistic, that if we can figure out how the fractures occur, we can fix them, right? Or stop them. As you might imagine, this is not a super fun time to be studying political and rhetorical divisiveness. Obviously, with the spread of misinformation and all we've heard today and last night. Earlier, Eva apologized. I think I'm going to do that as well. These are not happy times to be studying such a thing. I joke with my student, my only consolation is this ridiculous mental image I have of very cartoon Aristotle and Plato watching over this, with Plato occasionally murmuring, "I told you so." Specifically, I've been studying ideographs for the last 15 years or so. Ideographs, as defined by Michael Calvin McGee, are phrases and words that constitute the building blocks of ideology. McGee tells us that these phrases are often abstract, but nonetheless easily defined. We know what they are, and our public or manifest definitions are likely to be the same. The fractures really exist in the latent definitions. How do we go about achieving this ideal, and what it ought to look like in action? So, for example, we hear freedom being thrown around way too much these days as an ideological pursuit. We know and likely will agree to what freedom is, but what it looks like and how we achieve it is unbelievably different these days, looking at mask mandates and vaccines specifically. In this case, turning to Bitzer, perhaps the exigence of the rhetorical shift is the pandemic. I don't think that's the case. I think that the lack of social consequences for false information spread, and I'm not pointing the finger at the last president, but yeah, I am, really set the stage for this cry of freedom long before the pandemic even broke loose. So McGee tells us to look at ideographs in two ways: synchronically, which ideographs hang out with other ideographs, right? So cluster analysis in a way, but also diachronically. How is the history of the use of that ideograph? I would argue that rhetoricians, we have the synchronic down. We've got that pat. We know what ideographs hang out with others. We have a variety of tools and methodologies to unpack that. But we haven't done a really good job of looking at the diachronic. So over time, how do they come? How do they enter and exit the rhetorical environment? And so that's what I've been working on in recent years. I'm an external committee member for a student at International Islamic University of Islamabad, and he keeps saying, well, why? And I don't know why, but I'm trying to figure it out. So in what I'm going to do today a little bit, I want to talk about two examples of diachronic analyses of ideographs to try to highlight the chronic in diachronic. So why is an ideograph chronic as opposed to others that are not? So the first idea I want to talk about is the ideograph of marriage. And this is where I really started my research when I was a graduate student. So in 2008, we collected a rather large data set, Benjamin Bates of Ohio University and myself. And what we found, we asked a whole bunch of people just to define marriage. And they wrote down their definitions, and we subjected that to a grounded theory approach with axial coding. So it has a whole bunch of quantitative stuff. Despite the fact that I'm a rhetorician by training, I've never shook my quantitative roots from political science. It became really obvious to us that marriage was indeed at that moment functioning as an ideograph. It became obvious that the same-sex marriage legislation had a fighting chance, and at least in more progressive states, so marriage itself became a point of controversy. The big argument that we found underlying this ideograph, where the fracture was, and this will come back in when I talk about masks in a bit, is that the argument was that marriage should be reserved for only a man and a woman. This argument was guised under the religious institutions, right? So they can have something else, but marriage is only for cross-sex couples. But as we know, separate is never equal. So our data set revealed some interesting things. First of all, there is a latent definition or a manifest definition. Almost all the participants used this commitment cluster, I would say, or ideograph to cluster with marriage itself. In fact, 80%. We saw terms like commitment, legal bond, rest of life, promises, license, obligation, lawful union, and permanent bond. what we didn't expect we'd see was that 26% also used words about marriages ending, divorce, separation, falling out of love, not always forever, lack of permanence. And we attribute that now largely, and I'll talk about this in a minute because there's a second data set, was really attributed to the high divorce rates at that particular moment. Another theme that emerged was love. Yes, divorce scored higher than love in our definitions of marriage. If that's not scary, I don't know what is. But there it is. And then we had, at that point, 37% of the respondents did take a stance on same-sex marriage, and that's where we saw this is an ideograph. And like I said, many of them had religious undertones to them. So 10 years later, Ben and I decided, well, let's see if it's still there. So we know now that after the 2018 data set that marriage is no longer an ideograph. Well, maybe it is, we argue. There's a temporality of the ideological divisiveness associated with the same-sex marriage debate. And much to my celebration, when I saw this and I'm coding, there were only 4 students out of, and we surveyed undergraduate students, only 4 out of the entire data set that had opposition to same-sex marriage. And so that ideograph has fallen out. And when we originally published this, we argued that it was the Supreme Court ruling that ended it. In retrospect, I think that was really naive, as we're seeing challenges to Supreme Court rulings pretty consistently these days, given the new composition of the court. I'm really starting to think that I'm missing something here, and that's the money capital behind it all. So perhaps ideographs come in because they're part of a larger socioeconomic and perhaps just economic spectrum here. So the finance argument seems more realistic to me, and that the Supreme Court case has not caused those on the right or those left on the left, or those left in fewer cases to continue the pursuit. And so I've been starting to turn to an oldie but a goodie coming out of political science, which is where I started in my academic pursuits, in the idea of disturbance theory from David Bicknell Truman. And he argues that he's talking about political interest groups, that essentially we have divisiveness in large part because interest groups see a disturbance in culture and they decide to rise up. Not necessarily that they are created in as a result of the disturbance, but rather that they continue their pursuits because this disturbance exists. I would extrapolate this a little bit, and that the era of distributed interest gaming, that while Truman is talking about these formal lobbying groups, this was before Citizens United. And I think that gives us some exigence to talk about the ways in which unfettered corporate interests are now creating and responding to disturbances themselves. And so the second example I want to talk about is what we're currently living with, but I want to focus on the phrase "my body, my choice," as it's been readopted. So one of the ways in which ideographs emerge is through rhetorical theft, I would say, or resignification. In this case, I would not call it reclamation. This is not a new idea, but it's something we're definitely seeing these days. The folks on the right who are anti-vaccine are chanting "my body, my choice." According to Goyle of the LA Times, they trace this rhetorical theft back to groups including the Tennessee Coalition for Vaccine Choice and the Texans for Medical Freedom, which also has leadership on the anti-abortion rhetoric schema as well. So meanwhile, they stole this tagline, right, and from groups, in particular in Texas, which is interesting. They use this function to call the hypocrisy against the left. You claim that I can do with my body as I choose, but yet you're forcing vaccines on me. They mean it flippantly. They don't mean this as an authentic war cry, yet they're winning in both regards, right? Just Thursday night, we saw that a judge did not force healthcare professionals in New York to get vaccines. So interestingly, the freedom that is underlying the ideograph is the thing that is perpetuating this rhetoric. Synchronically, the mask is hanging out here as well. I would say that it's pales with freedom. Winkler and Edwards in 1997 and then Moore in 1993 argue that the images of objects function as visual ideographs. The mask certainly fits the bill here. I started to trace the roots of this, and this is what I'm working on now. Looking back at the 1918 Spanish flu, where the anti-masking rhetoric was brief, And it was more obvious as to what they were doing, that they didn't want the government officials to make decisions on their behavior. However, the current anti-masking rhetoric bridges both freedom and the bastardization of science, which would have made more sense in 1918 because they were wearing the things outside instead of inside, and the materials they were using were not exactly great. However, we are now seeing that they are attempting to use logos or science to perpetuate the myth about the mask itself. So this is what I'm working on now. My future research is to continue to unpack not the rhetoric itself, but the origins and the exits from the rhetorical environment. Thank you.